Her secret affair with the neighbor's son was meant to stay hidden, but one fateful night, everything spiraled out of control. What happens when betrayal turns deadly? Watch to uncover the shocking truth and witness a twist that no one saw coming. This is a story of love, lies, and murder, and it's far from over. Stay tuned to the end, because the real horror is just beginning. She looked out the kitchen window, hands trembling as she dried the dishes. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the yard. Her heart beat faster. She knew he would come. The sound of footsteps on gravel echoed from the driveway. Her pulse quickened. The boy next door. David, their neighbor's son. He was tall now. A man almost. His eyes were different though. More intense. The first time they spoke, it had been an innocent conversation. He had smiled at her, asking about the garden. But something had shifted. Something that neither of them could explain. Her husband was always busy. Always distant. But David was there. Always there. The days blurred into one another. He would come over after school, sit in the living room, talk about everything and nothing. She would offer him tea, laugh at his jokes. It felt easy, comforting. Then one day their hands touched. Just a brief moment. But it was enough. The world shifted. Her heart raced as she pulled back, but his eyes held hers. She couldn't look away. From that moment, things changed. The tension between them was undeniable. Each glance, each touch, charged with something they couldn't name. The heat of his breath in her ear. The softness of his lips on her neck. It was wrong, but it felt right. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything that came with it. The secrecy. The stolen moments. She could still feel the sweat on her palms as she waited for him. Her mind raced. What if someone found out? She closed her eyes, tried to calm the storm in her chest. But then the door creaked open. He was here. The boy she had never meant to fall for. The boy who now owned every thought, every breath she took. He stood at the door, eyes dark, filled with something she couldn't name. The silence between them stretched, thick with anticipation. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice low, husky. She nodded, unable to speak. He stepped inside. The air seemed heavier now. Every movement felt deliberate. Every breath measured. She led him to the living room, their usual spot. But today was different. Everything felt different. He sat beside her on the couch. Her heart pounded, her palms clammy. She couldn't stop staring at him. "Are you sure about this?" His question caught her off guard. Her chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. She had wanted this for so long. But now, the fear crept in. The fear of being caught. His hand brushed hers, sending a jolt through her body. She shivered. Her breath caught. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. His lips brushed against her ear. "I won't let anything happen to you." But she wasn't sure. The weight of what they were doing pressed down on her chest. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the doorbell rang. A sharp, sudden sound that shattered the moment. Her heart skipped. Who was it? Her husband? David's eyes flickered to the door. He stood up quickly, his face pale, but he didn't move toward the door. The bell rang again, louder this time, a frantic urgency. She stood frozen. The room was spinning, the world outside their little bubble, threatening to crash in. David's eyes locked onto hers. "You have to answer it," he said, his voice tight. "Now?" But she didn't move. Her feet felt like lead. The fear was suffocating. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was fast, impatient. Her heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. The door creaked open on its own, slowly. And then she saw him, her husband. But something was wrong. His face was twisted in rage, his eyes cold, full of something darker. Before she could react, he stepped forward, grabbing David by the collar. And then, the first scream. The scream echoed through the house,
sharp and raw.
David's eyes widened in terror. His breath quickened. Her husband's grip tightened. David struggled, trying to break free. But her husband was stronger. "Get off him," she shouted, but her voice cracked. She was frozen. Her legs wouldn't move. Her husband's face was contorted with fury. "You think I don't know?" His voice was low, menacing. "You think I didn't see it?" David's face turned red, his eyes desperate. "Let go of me,"
he gasped.
But the grip only tightened. She stepped forward, feeling the tremble in her hands. "Please," she whispered, but it was too late. In one swift motion, her husband shoved David against the wall. The sound of bone hitting plaster echoed through the room. David gasped, his body limp. Her heart raced as she watched him struggle to stay conscious. She stepped back, her stomach churning. A suffocating wave of guilt washed over her. This was her fault. Her husband turned to face her, his eyes burning with anger. "You did this. You brought him into our house, into our lives." He raised his hand. The slap came fast,
hard.
She didn't see it coming. Her cheek stung. The force of it left her dizzy. But the worst was the look in his eyes. The look of betrayal. David was still on the floor, barely moving. Her heart sank. She ran to him, kneeling beside him. He was breathing, but barely. Blood trickled from his lip. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. But David didn't respond. His eyes were glazed over. Her husband stood there, his breath heavy. "I warned you," he said, his voice cold and steady. The air in the room felt thick, like the world had stopped moving. The silence was suffocating. And then, without another word, her husband turned and left. The door slammed shut behind him. She was alone with David. And everything was broken. She didn't know what to do. Her mind raced. She needed to help him.
But how?
She looked at him, her hands trembling as she tried to steady him. But David's body was still. Too still. A sense of dread crept up her spine. Something was wrong. Something terrible had happened. The weight of the moment hit her all at once. She had pushed too far. She had crossed a line. And now, she might have lost everything. She pulled him into her arms, feeling his body go limp in her hold. But she couldn't stop the tears. Couldn't stop the sinking feeling in her chest. Her hands shook as she held David, his body lifeless in her arms. Her breath was shallow, uneven. Her heart was pounding in her chest. But the world outside seemed distant. Everything was muffled, as though she were underwater. She couldn't think clearly, couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Her mind screamed for action, but her body refused to respond. She shook David gently, desperate. "David, wake up," she whispered, her voice cracking. But there was no response. His skin was cold, his pulse weak. Tears blurred her vision. She needed to do something. She couldn't let this happen. But where was her husband? Why had he done this? She had never seen him like this before. Never. Everything they had built, the life they had, was slipping away, crumbling in front of her eyes. Suddenly, a thought pierced her mind. The phone. She needed to call for help. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, but it was out of her grasp. She could barely keep her eyes open. She blinked hard, trying to focus. David's condition was worsening. Her heart skipped a beat.
Her phone rang.
The sudden sound was jarring. She jumped, nearly dropping it. She glanced at the screen. It was her husband. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. What was she supposed to say? Her breath hitched as she looked back at David. The seconds stretched into minutes. Her mind raced, but all she could do was hold him. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening for any sign of life. But all she heard was the silence, the hollow echo of her own heartbeat. Her thoughts spiraled. The weight of the moment sank deeper. How had it come to this? What had they all become? She glanced at the front door, wondering if her husband would return. She wondered what he would do if he found her still holding David. Would he come back to finish it? Would he even care? But that wasn't what mattered now. What mattered was David. She had to save him. She had to make things right. With all the strength she could muster, she pulled David into a sitting position. She had to get him to a hospital, had to get him help. Every breath felt like a struggle. Her body screamed with exhaustion. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. She stood shakily, and for a moment, it felt like the world was closing in on her. The walls seemed to move, the floor shifting beneath her feet. She couldn't let go. Not yet. Not now. With one last effort, she took a step toward the door, her hands still clutching David. She staggered, her legs unsteady beneath her. Each step felt like a battle. David's weight was too much, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let him slip away. The front door loomed ahead, its handle cold under her fingers. She hesitated. Would her husband come back? Would he stop her? Her heart hammered in her chest. But she forced the door open. The cool night air hit her like a wave. She stepped outside. But the world felt unreal. Everything was distorted. The driveway stretched before her, empty and silent. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. David's body was growing colder in her arms. She couldn't waste time. She staggered toward her car, her eyes scanning the empty street.
It was all so quiet.
She opened the car door, gently laying David across the back seat. Her hands were trembling, but she did her best to keep steady. The engine roared to life, the sound deafening in the stillness. She gripped the wheel, taking a deep breath. Every turn felt like it was dragging her deeper into something she couldn't escape. What was she doing? Where was she going? The hospital was miles away, but it felt like an eternity. David's shallow breathing was the only sound in the car, and it filled her with dread. Her mind raced. She couldn't make sense of what had happened. Why did everything have to go so wrong? Her husband, David, her own choices. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The flashing lights of the hospital emerged in the distance, blinking like a beacon of hope. But even as she approached, she knew that hope was fleeting. What could she do now? What could anyone do? She pulled into the emergency lane, slamming the car into park. The hospital doors swung open, and she ran out, her heart racing faster than her feet could carry her. A nurse rushed toward her, looking at David, and then at her. "What happened?" the nurse asked, but her voice seemed far away. She couldn't answer. She could barely find the words. All she could think about was how it had come to this. How a simple moment of weakness had spiraled into something uncontrollable. And now, she had no idea how to fix it. David's lifeless body was carried into the hospital, and with him, her entire world. The sterile walls of the hospital felt suffocating. She stood by the entrance, frozen, watching as the medical team rushed David inside. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She wanted to follow them, but her legs wouldn't move. Everything was spinning, like she was trapped in a nightmare. A nurse came toward her, her face kind but distant. "Are you the one who brought him in?" She nodded, unable to speak. Her throat felt tight, as though something had lodged itself there. "Do you know what happened?" the nurse asked, her voice softer now. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind was blank, consumed with images of David, his broken body, the look of fear in his eyes. She should have known better. Should have stopped it before it went too far. The nurse watched her for a moment, waiting for an answer. Finally, she spoke again. "We'll take care of him. You should sit down." But the last thing she wanted was to sit. She wanted to run, to escape. Her mind raced. Flashes of the confrontation with her husband, his hands around David's neck, the cold fury in his eyes. She could still feel the weight of it. The crushing guilt, the fear. Her husband. What had he done? What was he going to do when he found out she was here? The hospital doors swung open, and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Her husband. He stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, before locking onto her. His face was expressionless, a mask of calm, but she could see the rage beneath it. It was in the way he moved, the rigidness of his posture. He walked toward her slowly. Every step felt like it was echoing in her chest. When he finally stood in front of her, there was a moment of silence. Then he spoke. "Is he dead?" Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. She couldn't answer. She couldn't look him in the eye. And for the first time, she realized the full extent of her actions. Her affair. Her choices. Everything had led to this. It was too late to fix anything now. Her breath caught in her throat as her husband's cold gaze pierced through her. She tried to speak, but the words felt stuck. A thick lump in her chest that wouldn't move. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was as if the world had fallen silent, the tension between them palpable. David's fate hung in the air. Her heart was still pounding. The fear, the guilt, a heavy weight she couldn't shake. "What have we become?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She felt a tremor run through her body. Her husband's face softened, just slightly, but it was enough to show the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to die on his tongue. A nurse approached them quietly, her voice breaking the moment. "We're doing everything we can," she said, her eyes flicking from one to the other. But those words felt like nothing. No amount of medical intervention could undo the damage that had already been done. The nurse hesitated, her gaze lingering on the couple before turning away. They were left alone, and the silence between them stretched out like an endless void. It was a silence they couldn't fill, a gap that nothing would ever bridge. "I never wanted this," she finally said, her voice raw. "I never wanted any of this to happen." Her husband's eyes closed for a moment, his face betraying a mix of exhaustion and regret. He looked at her, but there was no anger in his eyes now, just emptiness. They had both crossed a line, and now there was nothing left to say. The door to the emergency room opened, and the doctor walked out, his face grim. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The doctor looked at them both, then spoke softly. He didn't make it. Her world seemed to collapse in on itself. The weight of her actions, the consequences of her choices, all came crashing down on her. David was gone, and she was left with nothing. Nothing but the unbearable quiet, and the knowledge that her life, her marriage, everything she once held dear, had unraveled beyond repair.